Good evening. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for the history of the Shepaug Railroad. This evening, Donald Woodworth, our distinguished guest, will share his interesting story on the history of the Shepaug Railroad. Gene Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing him. During this lecture, we please ask that you mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Donald will answer some of them at the end. Please note that our next guest lecturer is Christine Adams, who will present Lake Warramog and the generations of people who made it their own on Monday, April 18th, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. on Zoom. Please mark your calendars and register for this presentation on the Gunn Museum's website. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Jean.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jean Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Donald Woodworth. Colonel Woodworth, formerly of Oxford, Connecticut, has resided in O'Fallon, Illinois since 1986, where he served as an air transportation officer with the Military Airlift Command at nearby Scott Air Force Base, and where he remained following his retirement to work as a transportation and logistics consultant for the Northrop Grumman Corporation. Upon graduation from the University of Connecticut in 1965, Don was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force and served in many locations in the United States and overseas. His career was bookended by service in Vietnam and the First Gulf War, but his most enjoyable tours of duty were spent in the United Kingdom. Don has a lifelong interest in Connecticut railroads and has a special affection for the Shepaug. Thank you, Don, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Well, you have the subject of my presentation here, so I will start. As I said, or as Jean said, I'm a former transportation officer. I've always loved the Shepaug. Through the courtesy of the Gunn Museum, I have done 2 previous presentations. You can see the dates there, based on one done in 2012 by Mr. Bob Devine. He was the last known surviving New Haven Railroad employee who had actually worked on the Shepaug. He worked on a track gang. He came at it from more a working man's point of view, and I'm coming at it from a more perhaps managerial and historical point of view. So one builds on the other. I've got a lot of photos that I've used here, most of them courtesy of the Gunn Museum, and most of them are not mine. I've got a bibliography that'll that'll show where most of them are, but I just wanted folks to know right up front, I'm not trying to plagiarize anybody else's stuff. This has just grown over time, and I absolutely do not want credit for somebody else's work. What we have here is the tip of the iceberg. I could probably double the length of this, but we're keeping it to an hour today just so we don't go overboard. And in advance, I would like to thank the many people who've helped me put this together with thoughts or information or photos. That said, in the beginning, railroad financing, especially for little lines, rural lines in any state, was a shaky business. The Shepaug cost about $634,000 to build, about $20,000 per mile, done in stock and bonds. Salesmen would go town to town trying to sell stock to various towns, to individual people, getting farmers to donate right away instead of sell it, this kind of thing. They finally got a railroad put together, but it was pretty rickety. Because of that and their shaky finances, the railroad was reorganized twice. When it started to operate, it could cover its operating expenses, but not the bonded indebtedness, and that routinely killed it. So it was reorganized in 1873 as the Shepaug Railroad Company, and again in 1887 as the Shepaug, Litchfield, and Northern. And given that title, some of the employees gave it the appellation of the Great Northern, because originally there was some thought to building farther north. In the late 1890s, the New Haven Railroad was gobbling up anything that floated or had steel wheels in southern New England. Trolley lines, boat lines, competing railroads, you name it. So during that time period, and knowing that the Shepaug was always kind of shaky in the finance department, its trustees knew a deal when they saw it, and they leased the line to the New Haven Railroad. And in that capacity, it ran as New Haven's Litchfield branch until the summer of 1948, when it was abandoned. To finance a railroad, obviously you have to sell stock. And this is a nice exhibit of a piece of Shepaug Valley Railroad stock. You'll notice, I think it was for one share. Yes, one share at $100. Stock issued during that period of time was still taxed to help finance the Civil War, which had just ended. The stamp I'm showing on the left here is not the stamp on the document. I just took a bigger one, took one out of my collection and blew it up just so you could see what it looks like. 25-cent certificate was about the norm, 25 cents for a piece of stock. The stamp on the right, you'll have to go to the museum to see the full story, but I will not tell you the story here. Suffice it to say, the Washington Match Company was supposed to become a traffic source for the railroad. It did for a little bit, and then crumped simply because it was too far from its market and it was too hard to staff the company. The rest, you can see Stephen has a nice little exhibit with one of these stamps that are donated. So a thumbnail on the line's building. The idea of a Litchfield line arose in the 1840s as Housatonic Railroad was building north about one ridge line to the west. It built north from Bridgeport through Ridgefield on up to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It was the brainchild of Major Edwin McNeil of Litchfield, and Major was an appellation he acquired rather after the war. He was not actually a major in the Union Army, but that's what he went by. Litchfield was the last county seat in Connecticut to receive rail service. So I suspect the genesis of his brainchild was, we're the only county seat without service. To be on the map, to be important, yada, yada, we need rail service. So he drove that and caused a railroad to be built. The Shepaug Valley Charter of June 1866 lapsed. No work was done. It was rechartered. Construction began in October of 1870, going north from the Housatonic and New York and New England railroads at Hawleyville and coming south from Litchfield. Litchfield had to be a trip because they would team. People from Connecticut know what a long climb it is on Route 118 coming up from East Litchfield to Litchfield. Well, they would have to team all the material, ties, steel, all of that stuff up into Litchfield before they could start to build. The tunnel south of Washington Depot, and the tunnel, of course, is locally famous. That was open in July of 1871. And once they could build through there, the ends of the line were joined in Bantam on the 7th of December, 1871. Is that right? Let me see. So regular service began in January of 1872 when locomotive number 2, the Warramog, first arrived in town. Very shortly after that, they built the Bethel extension, which ran about 6 miles from Hawleyville down into Bethel, and that was abandoned in 1911. That was the first earliest abandonment in the state of Connecticut. As noted, the New Haven acquired the majority of Shepaug's stock in 1892, and it absorbed the line in 1898, becoming its Litchfield branch. It was pretty prosperous up until the 1920s, when good roads and highways started to erode all of its high value traffic, leaving it with just bulk stuff like stone and ice. So the New Haven petitioned, well, once in 1937 and finally 47, they got lucky. It was granted in 1948, and the last train ran in June of 48. And then they had a scrapper from Boston come in and tear up the line later that summer and fall. So if you go to see the wonderful 250 years of Washington at the museum, you will see a little bit about how the railroad opened up the countryside. To travel the 32 miles from Litchfield to Hawleyville, if you look on the slide here, you can see the first train, a morning train, left at 6:25. It got to Hawleyville at 8 a.m., about an hour and 35 minutes to go 32 miles rather. If you were doing that on horseback, it would have been about a 7-hour journey. So the railroad's contribution into opening the general area between Litchfield and Hawleyville was absolutely astounding. It just liberated the countryside. This is a map, it's a schematic that I took out of Fletcher Cooper's book, and I'll talk about more of that later, but it shows where the line ran from Litchfield, where the brainchild or the genesis of the line originated, down through Bantam to Romford, the outer suburb, as it were, of Washington, New Preston, Washington Valley Station, and on down to Hawleyville through Plum Trees to Bethel. And it connected with a Housatonic that would have come up from Bridgeport across like this up to Pittsfield, the Danbury and Norwalk, and the New York and New England from Boston over, or from Boston, Waterbury over into New York. So Hawleyville was sort of the center of the universe for a while in this little corner of Connecticut. This is a gradient profile for the railroad. It's sort of like an inverted V. You had the short leg of the V on the Hawleyville side going down to the Housatonic River, and the long end of the V going north to Litchfield. And rather than putting this in a huge sheet of paper, the railroad elected to do it in sections. So you get the Judge Bridge and then Judge Bridge to Romford and on to Litchfield. So it dropped about 200 feet in 5-6 miles going from Hawleyville to Junction down to the Housatonic River Bridge. And it climbed like the Dickens all the way to 950 feet above sea level at Litchfield. So the engines, depending which way they were going, would work their hearts out moving the cargo over the line. They'd originally thought to bring it to Torrington or a point west of Winston on the Connecticut Western Railroad, but thankfully that was never done because about the only traffic they'd likely would have had would be cans of milk and not much else. At one point, some wag counted the number of curves in the line, and they reckoned it was about 150 curves, which made 18 air mile Hawleyville Litchfield into about 32 miles if the Crow had to take the train as opposed to fly. My late friend, Mr. Blakesley, was a New Haven engineer. He ran on this line. And in his book, Brief History of Lines West, noted in season, 27 cars of ice would be hauled from Bantam down to New York. And I put hauled in quotes because literally they would shove the train downhill to the river. And of course, then the engines would have to work their little hearts out, bringing the train up to Hawleyville. And the same would apply for carloads of stone coming out of the Roxbury quarries. You would never think about it today, driving across the state highway, Hawleyville Road, from the exit there on the interstate. But at one time, Hawleyville was a really busy nerve center, and about 150 trains a day traveled through there. And of course, now if you get 3 trains a week to the lumberyard there, you've done really, really well. But just imagine 120 years ago, 150 trains a day through there. It was day and night. So what makes a railroad go? Steam, lots of it. And steam engines are thirsty creatures by their very nature. They evaporate about 6 3/4 pounds of water for every pound of coal burned. So a tender on a little K-class mogul, which would have operated in freight service on this line, would hold 12 tons of coal, about 24,000 pounds, which was easily enough for a round trip from Danbury to Litchfield and back. But it only held about 58,000 pounds of water, and it would need 162,000 pounds if they were to have a 1-to-1 fuel ratio. Since it's easier to deal with water than it is for coal, the railroad solution was to put in water tanks at Hawleyville, Shepaug, Washington Depot, and Litchfield. And the job of the fireman, besides bailing real estate into the firebox, would be to always ensure that there was sufficient water over the crown sheet of the firebox, because if that went dry, an explosion would follow in short order. And generally, if that happened, the crew was killed. So those were the 2 most important functions of firemen: fuel to make it go and water to make steam and avoid an explosion. The line, by virtue of following the Bantam and Shepaug rivers, was very curvy. It used light rail. It had poor ballast, and the combination equaled low speed. 20 miles an hour was about the limit. Data for 1917 to 21 shows it was relayed with 70-pound steel rail, that's 70 pounds of the yard, but originally it was laid with iron rail, which was adequate, but especially in cold weather was very brittle, tended to snap under a train, things like that. So steel was much better. It used cinder ballast between Hawleyville and Roxbury Falls and around Litchfield, and earth ballast in between. And I put ballast in quotes because earth is terrible ballast. It doesn't promote good drainage. And the effect is ties rot out much more rapidly. As noted, the speed limit was about 20 miles on the line. It never really got above that. And contributing to the pokiness, most of us as motorists are familiar with stop, look, and listen at a railroad crossing, and the railroad, the engine by convention sounds two longs, a short and a long blast to tell people coming through. On the Shepaug, there were 4 locations where just the opposite happened, where the train had to stop and flag the crossing to protect traffic as the train went across instead of vice versa. Now, to keep a line fluid, obviously you can't have just one piece of track because otherwise trains would either back up or collide. So the solution is passing sidings. And I've taken this information from railroad employee timetables from 1928, 36, and 43. You can see here. And I've showed for a year the towns that had sidings and the length of the sidings. And you can see Lake right near Bantam had the longest siding on the line. And that was to accommodate the big loads of ice that would come out of Bantam Lake to move down to New York City. You can see during the Depression, things started to get sparse. And by the end, 43 to 48, things were really sparse. But that just gives you an idea of traffic on the line and how it evaporated over time and contributed to the line's abandonment. Bridges on the line obviously had to be strong enough to accommodate the weight of a locomotive. And there was a system devised by Theodore Cooper in 1894 to basically rate the capacity of bridges. So an E41 meant that a bridge would have a capacity of 41,000 pounds, a locomotive maximum axle weight, which would equate to about 20 tons, and nothing the Shepaug ever ran or the New Haven ran after exceeded that. So they could safely travel up and down the line knowing that they were not going to collapse a bridge. Likewise, they had to be cognizant of the height and width of freight cars. So between Hawleyville and Judd's Bridge, they could have cars 15 feet wide, 10 feet, 8 inches high. Beyond that, the width and height shrunk by about 6 inches. I don't know the reason for that, but I suspect largely a bridge clearance or a tunnel clearance limitation. And of course, the problem, if you ran something that exceeded the clearance limitations, you had an instant accident. There was a turntable at Litchfield, 60 feet in diameter, wooden truss. It could comfortably handle the engines that were allowed to operate up the line. So that worked out nicely. 440 types predominated in passenger service and 260s in freight. And I will talk about those numbers in just a second with the locomotive pictures that follow. This is an example of one of the 3 original locomotives that ran on the Shepaug. Number 2 on the Shepaug Railroad, the Warramong, built by Rogers Locomotive Company in Paterson, New Jersey in 1871, and it cost $11,000. As traffic grew, the railroad added additional engines of its own, but these all disappeared after the New Haven took over the line, and it introduced more modern standardized engines. This engine is called an American type or an 8-wheeler or just simply a 440. And what this means, if you look at the front here, the pony truck under the front of the engine where the cylinders are, there's an axle with 2 wheels and an axle with 2 wheels. So that gives you your 4. If you look here, you see 2 large wheels. So there's 2 axles, a driving wheel on each side. So 4 drivers. So that gives you your second 4. And the 0 indicates that there's nothing trailing here. On larger, more modern locomotives, there'd often be a second or a single axle or 2 axles, and they were added to accommodate larger fireboxes, which could generate more steam. But in the case of the Shepaug, the speeds were low, the engines were light, so a 260, a 460, or a 440 were quite adequate. And I would note, this is one of the most common engine types built in the United States. Some 25,000 of them were built between about 1840 and about 1900, give or take. I've included this simply because Mr. Cooper's excellent book, The Shepaug Railroad, has a picture of a sister engine to this, sadly derailed and in a ditch at Lake Station in 1911. I don't like pictures of trains off the track, so I decided I would find a picture of one of these engines on the track. And these were simply called 10-wheelers, and again, 4 plus 6 makes 10, so 10-wheeler. And toward the end of the Shepaug, this would have been the most common type of steam engine to operate up the line on their little 2 or 3 time a week mixed freights. These were called moguls or 260s. The New Haven had about 300 of these, give or take. And these were just light to medium power freight engines, a go any place, do anything engine, as long as you didn't want to do it super quickly. And I chose a picture from Danbury, since these engines would have operated from Danbury over to Hawleyville up to Litchfield and back, and they would have been very, very much at home on this line. When passenger service ended, they needed a cheaper way to provide, let me backtrack. When it became uneconomical to operate passenger service with steam engines, because they would add an engine with a crew of 2 people in and probably 3 people on the train, 5 men to run a train that might carry fewer people in the crew, the railroad needed a cheaper way to do it. So their solution in 1921 was to buy some Mack rail cars. The prime mover, the motor under the hood here, and the wheels and stuff would have built by the Mack Corporation down in Allentown, Pennsylvania, the people that still build trucks. The body was put together by Osgood Bradley up in Worcester, Massachusetts. And the result was shipped to the New Haven, and the New Haven had a small fleet of these cars. They were all scrapped by 1939. When the New Haven ended passenger service with these, the hue and cry to the ICC was such that they were compelled to still operate a mixed train. So they operated a coach. They would add a coach to their freight. And later on, I think they just simply used a caboose because hardly anybody would travel that way. At the very end, steam was gone and diesels, and I use the term, I think, diesel here deliberately because my great preference is steam engines, but I can understand why the railroads went to diesels. But this engine here is typical of the locomotive that would apply the line from Danbury in the last couple of years of its existence. So what I propose to do now, I'm going to take you on a photographic trip from Litchfield to Bethel, station by station by station. Each location is identified by a milepost. The railroads do that to have a precise knowledge of where trains are at a given time. This picture, the inset, is not a milepost. Usually a milepost was basically a mile number on a post stuck into the ground at a given location. This happens to be on a bridge that I photographed up in West Cornwall, Connecticut, on the old Housatonic. But it shows what they would do would be a sign similar like this. They would have the precise location. So if a crew had to contact the dispatcher, they could tell them we're at milepost such and such, blah, blah. Where I know the exact location of a milepost from a railroad employee's timetable, I have smooth ellipses. If it's an interpolated location, I've used crunchy ones. And in cases where a flag stop was involved, and that's simply an unstaffed low traffic halt where somebody would have, if they were on the train, they'd have to tell the conductor in advance they wanted to depart, or they would have to wave down the train so the engineer could see them and stop that way. So the way I've done this is for each station, we'll have a sign, an indicator like Lake Station. Lake is a part of Bantam. So in cases when it's sort of a suburb or a location of a larger official town, I put the town in yellow brackets so you will know, and this becomes important when we get to Washington, because Washington has a lot more suburbs, as it were, than many people might realize. And I've begun this with a list of operators' names. Like politics, a lot of railroading is local. And since local people tend to watch the presentations that I give on this and other subjects, where I can find, for example, the names of people that worked, for example, the agents here at a given station. I put these in because it's kind of fun if you see somebody that was an agent or a friend of the family or a relative or something like that, and you could trace them down. It's fun to look that information up because you know where they were and what they were doing at a given stage in their life, in this case, 1920. I had been asked, because some people viewing this may not be familiar with the area, just to put in a little refresher map again, so people will know what we're doing. And like I say, it's from Litchfield down through Bantam, Romford, Washington, still the center of the universe, down to Hawleyville, through Plum Trees to Bethel. So we will begin at the beginning in Litchfield. This is a view of the station. It ended track in about 1930. The station was completed in 1871. The ground floor was for the use of passengers. The upper story was for the use of railroad employees. This view shows a layout of Litchfield as it would have looked roughly back then. You can see there was a turntable here to turn the engines, a small engine house, a freight house, the passenger station. And the farthest north that the Great Northern ever got was across US 202 West Street, which served the J. William Tannery here. So pity the poor people waiting on the station on a hot summer day and the wind blowing the wrong direction. I'm sure they couldn't wait to board a train fast enough because the smell must have been ungodly. I mentioned the turntable at Litchfield. Turntables could be operated in several different ways. If you were at a major terminal, it was normally operated by compressed air or electricity. But if you were out in the hinterlands, it was what they called euphemistically an Armstrong turntable. You can see the heavy timber sticking out from the end of the table. The engineer would position the engine over the center of the center point of the gravity of the engine over the center point of the turntable. And then the crewman, as you see here, would get a hernia, shoving it around in a circle to turn it in the opposite direction to make a return journey. Toward the end, Litchfield fell on fairly hard times. You can see the second story is gone, the platforms are gone, the building was turned 180, and if you look carefully, you can just see the tracks and the weeds. Then, of course, the tracks were gone, and the station has gone through many iterations since as a sandwich shop and as a flower shop on Russell Street. And I learned just recently through the kindness of a newspaper clipping that Stephen shared with me that the owners have donated the building just in this past February to the Litchfield Land Trust, who plan to restore it as a railroad to look like a railroad station again for their new offices. So I thought that was just, to die for cool. So if we go just about 2 miles south of Litchfield, we get to Lake. You can see the little sign Lake here, which denotes the shelter. It's an open air shelter. And this is probably the second one that was built at this location. There was an earlier, probably even more primitive one that would have served people going vacationing at the lake. In the background, just here, you can see a switch stand. Well, there was a little side track, a spur that ran down to a lake, to an ice house on the shore of Lake Bantam. There were scales here, so when the carloads of ice were taken from the storehouse by the railroad, they would weigh them there, and then they'd be made into a freight train, and the weight derived at the ice at the scales would have been used to bill the consignor or the consignee for the cost of shipping the freight. This is another view of Bantam. You see the station here. The station was raised in, I think, 1940, but this area just in the foreground is where the tracks were joined after they built through the tunnel in December of 1871. Then we move on to Morris. This is a period view, and I was very kindly provided by the Morris Historical Society some current day photos. My frustration is I can't show all the pictures here, but this building was originally used as a station. You can see it was probably a store downstairs. There's a door, a porch, some windows. This has now become converted into a house. People still live there. This is a garage. This would be the station. And the Historical Society has put up a marker, and I think it was mentioned, Lee Swift mentioned that they were going to go back and just check the brush, because I looked for this a couple of years and couldn't go and find it. I wasn't able to find it, but she very kindly went and took some photos. So I just put a little inset of the plaque that the Morris Historical Society had put up with the location of the marker at 68 Smoky Hollow Road. That's about 5 miles west of Morris proper, but this is where people from Morris would have had to go to catch the train. And here's a nice shot of a train coming into Morris. The station, the train would be on the just to the west of the station. Obviously, this is in winter. You can see the canvas shield, I guess, for lack of a better word, to help protect the crew in the cab, because a locomotive cab is a pretty drafty place. And you can see a trainman back here. This had to be a mixed train because there's 2 freight cars, and you can just see the hint of either a coach or a combine back here. So that's a nice view of a train actually in service on the line. Then we moved down to Romford, which until recently I did not realize was actually a part of Washington. And I learned that from Stephen when we were doing a dry run of this presentation. The original station did not have a little platform on the end, but as traffic grew, they added this platform to accommodate milk cans. These 10-gallon cans are surprisingly heavy. Loaded, they weigh about 90 pounds. So you can imagine the work that a trainman would have to do during the short period of time a train was stopped in the station, if they had to hustle, 5 or 10 of these into a train. Empty is not so bad coming off a train, but the loads going down to Southern Connecticut or New York, a heck of a lot of work. And note this little lamp here. I expect this was an oil lamp, but there's an interesting story that goes with this, which you will see in the next slide. And that is, the station was destroyed by fire in 1917. You can see the remnants in the foreground, and the only thing remaining is this little pole. So this orients the photo. The solution, rather than building a new station, which the railroad elected not to do because of the small volume of traffic, was to put a passenger car here to serve as a station for the small number of attending passengers. And there was a platform just below this where people could transload cargo to or from a train. And you can see here what this platform would have looked like. There's the Romford sign, the stop railroad crossing, the crossing. And the reason I put this little inset here is this Romford sign still exists. And if you go to the playing fields just south of Rumsey School, you can see this installed on the side of a small building there to one side of the parking lot. Then moving down almost into Greater Washington Depot, we get to New Preston. New Preston had 2 stations. You can see the original. This is the one in the background. Passenger traffic built at New Preston, probably because of the proximity of Lake Warmog, to the point where they built a new station, this one, in 1912. My expectation was when traffic built, passengers, of course, use this station. Freight traffic, milk, and likely stone coming up from Marbledale use this station. And at one time, there was a branch line posited either by the railroad, and I recall someplace maybe a trolley line over to New Preston to serve Lake Warmog and the traffic there. But probably, thankfully for the railroad, that never occurred, because it might have been okay during the summers for maybe 5 years. But with the advent of automobiles, it would have been a major money loser. If you know where to look around Beebrook Road, sort of opposite the Washington Fire Department, you can still see the humps in the ground and concrete slabs where these buildings once stood. Then we move into Washington Depot, which before it became Washington Depot was called Factory Hollow. And there was probably a lot more industry there in the 1870s than there are now. But this is the original station. Sadly, it burned 2 years after this picture was taken in 1895. Lightning struck a general store nearby and the fire spread to the station. But later, in 1895, the New Haven Railroad built a new station for almost $3,000. It stood where now the Washington Post Office stands and two banks. And you can see the station, of course, this end would have been for freight, the operator in this little bay window, and a passenger section up here. And of course, Washington Supply in the background over in this corner in a team track serving that area. This is a nice postcard, a color postcard from about 1910. You can see a train coming north into the depot. You can see a water tower, which would have served the trains or the tank. And this skinny little thing here would have been the standpipe. So the train would have had to stop just short of the station in order to take water and then pull forward to on or offload passengers. This is another view looking just north from the station. This would date to prior to 1900. Because it's a little hard to see here, but the cars had what they call Lincoln pin couplers. There was a pocket on the cars, and a brakeman would have to take, it's like a big link of chain, and insert it in, put in a pin, and then do the same thing with the other car to link them together. And you could almost always tell a brakeman if he'd been on service with the railroad for a little bit of time, because they'd usually be missing one or two fingers, because it was a very dangerous thing to be doing. To the left here, you can see some cars. Again, this would be on the siding to serve the Borden Creamery. Here you can see the creamery, and this stood where the Washington Town Hall now stands. You can see a side track going up to it, which would have run off by the station. But creameries, a lot of the smaller towns had creameries before things were consolidated into bigger operations. So Washington Depot had a reasonably sized little creamery serving the general area. This view had been provided to Stephen by Dana Grossman, who grew up in Washington. And she thought it might be a railroad building. So I did some research on it, and it's certainly railroad related. It was not a railroad building. It was part of the Borden Creamery complex located at 17 River Road. This is a picture Dana had before her family took over the building. And this is a picture after they took it over. Her dad did a wonderful job in rehabilitating it twice, because just after they did it in 1954, the flood rearranged their lives for them, and it had to be done a second time. Later became a piano center and then a dentist's office, and it still stands. You can go and see it. So it's a lovely building that's had some tender loving care applied to it. These are some wonderful pictures. This shows the, again, color picture of the Borden building with the supply in the background, and just a hint of the station and the order boards. And this is from River Road before the hump was taken out of it. After the railroad was abandoned, River Road was brought right down the level grade of the railroad. These two pictures are particularly wonderful. I don't know the dates on them. I'm guessing about 46, because color film probably would not have been available to the general public during World War II. So these would have had to be in the window of time after the end of the war, but prior to the summer of 1948, when the line was abandoned. And I was just sort of gobsmacked to see a color picture of the tracks and stuff. My only wish, if I could make a train appear, I would do it. But these are still an absolute treasure and wonderful to share. This is the station as I remember it. My dad grew up in Woodbury. I grew up in Oxford, because after my dad was an adult, that's where he lived. But we would often take automobile rides on Sunday afternoons up through Roxbury, up to New Milford and stuff, because my dad had relatives and friends there. And this sort of by default became my favorite part of Connecticut, still is. I can remember as a kid bouncing over the tracks here. The line had not been abandoned too long ago. And I just always had an immense curiosity. What about the railroad station? Where did it go? When did it go? I was doubly fascinated by the coal silos behind the supply. You can see them up here. And who to thunk it, some 70 years later, I would be giving a talk in this very building after it was moved over to become the American Legion, when Stephen invited me a second time back to Washington to talk about this. This is one of my favorite, very favorite photos, courtesy of the Gunn Museum. You can clearly see it says Washington Supply Company. You can see the tracks in the foreground. There would have been a track coming down here that served to serve offloading lumber to the sheds. But this would be pre-1909 because the coal towers don't exist in the background. Uncle Sam, I didn't think about it when I still lived around Connecticut. And after I was in the Air Force, it was too late. Uncle Sam had other plans for me. But Stephen very kindly provided me again from the museum's wonderful resources, a picture of the coal silos. You can see this is the side track that would have led down to where they would have offloaded and stored lumber in the sheds. To the back, they would have had another track with an elevator that would have taken various grades of coal up into these towers. I'm sure it moved along sort of a conveyor up here. And then you can see the chutes down here where it would have been offloaded first into teams like you see here, and later into trucks until coal became passé in the 40s as everybody shifted from coal to oil. This, of course, is where the station, guys in which the station still exists to this particular day, moved after the 55 flood. And as I say, who'd have thunk it, I was absolutely tickled in 2019 to give the presentation in this building. Moving south, we have Valley Station. And what I learned, again, through the courtesy of the Gunn Museum, in doing this, I thought this was the first and only station that existed at Valley. But au contraire, from 1893, there was another station. You can see the platform here with kind of a little gazebo. And this was later replaced when the suspension bridge was built around, I think, 1903 by John Roebling of Brooklyn Bridge fame. And this led east over the river on a path up to Holiday House. And I know Stephen gives presentations on Holiday House, so I won't beat this to death. Save to say it was built in 1893, and through the generosity of Mr. Van Ingen, poor working class girls would be afforded a free week in the country, courtesy of his generosity, where they would get to enjoy the fresh air at Holiday House, and a free trip to and from Washington over the Shepaug, and they would get there by walking across this bridge and up the hill with their suitcase, until finances forced the closure of the Holiday House in 1918. One of the two scenic highlights on the railroad, of course, is the tunnel at the neck of the clamshell. When the railway was building, everything was pick, shovel, horse teams, and some dynamite. So whereas today, a railroad going through something like this might have just blown out and used front end loaders to take the overburden away, the railroad tunneled through. This still exists as a hiking trail as part of the Steep Rock Trust. But at the time, they had with hand tools, horse and teams, dig and blast their way through 235 feet of rock, sort of on a curve. And that was the key to joining up the railroad. South of there at Judd's Bridge, there was a flag stop. It was established in 1873 as part of the effort to grow traffic on the railroad. There still exists a large farm here, and I suspect larger back in 1873. So this would have been a place where they'd ship out milk and probably ship in feed and things like this. I cannot tell, the photo is too indistinct. I can't tell if this is, what kind of building this is in the background. So the jury is out in this picture. And the reason I say out, the building, the shelter itself still exists. That's this square bit here. You can see where the line ran south here, north up toward Washington. And I'm not sure from looking at the building if this was part of the original station with just an extension behind, or if this bit of it's now a house, was added subsequent to the railroad being abandoned and just added onto this bit here. So it's a mystery. If somebody has some information on that and would like to share it with Stephen or directly with me, I would be most pleased to know. Moving down to Southbury, or Roxbury rather, a great source of track on the line was stone. The hope had been one time for the iron furnace at Mine Hill to produce traffic as well, but sadly that closed right at the time the railroad was opening. There were two quarries, one about 1.3 miles north of Roxbury Station and another about 1,300 feet. The one farthest north closed became disused prior to the valuation maps I have for 1915. But the map shows one of the two in service in 1915. So I'm guessing, but I cannot swear to it, this is the second of the two that remained in operation later, because this card probably would date to 1900, 1910, which would have been a period when a great postcard swept the United States and everybody sent postcards and everybody collected them. You can see here, this is doubly interesting. There's narrow gauge track. You can see the wide track here. You can see narrow gauge. Narrow gauge just means it's less than the standard gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches. And you can see dual gauge here. You can see the wide with a narrow one here. I suspect this crane was probably a narrow gauge crane, and it might have doubled as a locomotive to shift cars of stone around the quarry from where it was cut to where it was dressed and ready to go. And then they would have used a crane to transfer it onto standard gauge flat cars, and then the Shepaug would have hauled it away and made a little money in the process. One of the spurs still exists, courtesy of the Roxbury Land Trust. This was only open to the public, I think, in 2014. So I visited during one of my trips home. I live in Southern Illinois, so I get home to Connecticut once a year. I did not see any tie plates or spikes here, so I suspect this might have been put in by the trust just to show people what it would have looked like when railroad tracks ran to the end of the spur. But if you look very closely here, you can see a piece of rail in the dirt and the weeds and leaves. And I suspect this may be original and the scrappers forgot to take it out when they scrapped the line. So it's just a little treasure lurking in the weeds. This picture is not as sharp as I would like it, but it's the only one I've seen of Roxbury Station, a clear picture of the entire station when it was still in service. And you can see a gondola here, which would have been spotted for offloading of something or other at the station. In later years, in 2015, you can see the station here. I think by this point in time, the only thing that was keeping it standing was force of habit. You can see it's listing to one side. The building on the right, I think, was a factory that was once used as a cigar factory, amongst other things, but this has been kept in much better shape because somebody's had the care to maintain it. This shows a little bit of the cigar factory and the Allen Joy store just to the right, where the road would have crossed the main line of the Shepaug. You can see a standard highway sign, stop, and you can see one of the railroad signs, railroad crossing. It would have been a cast iron sign put up here. And I just put a little inset to give a clearer view because it's hard to see here. This is sort of a transitionary photo. Again, you can see the Allen store with teams of people coming in to pick up or leave off things to be shipped. The Shepaugs, or the Roxbury station, sometime between 2015, I think, when I took that other shot. You can see it's in the process of restoration here because the plywood has been taken off the windows and off the doors, etc. And Mr. Elliott Davis has done absolutely outstanding, authentic reconstruction of the station. He has salvaged what he could salvage legitimately, and of course added what needed to be added to make it a sound, functional building again. And this is a picture I took in July of 2017 after the building was functional again. And this is the piece de resistance of any building still existing on the Shepaug. This is a historically accurate reproduced station. I have no commercial relationship with the station at all, save to know it is now part of the Mine Hill Distillery. It is a venue for weddings and things like that. So anybody in the area that could use a bottle of whiskey or has a wedding or something like that coming up, I would say, given the tremendous amount of, this is obviously a labor of love, the tremendous amount of work that Mr. Davis has put into this and money, goodness sakes, if you love the Shepaug, patronize this site because it's a wonderful thing to do. End of unsolicited commercial. Moving south to Roxbury Falls, again, just a short way down the line from the Roxbury station, you can see they had another unmanned halt here You could get in out of the weather, but you couldn't get in out of the cold. I believe modern day Minor Bridge Road runs between these two buildings. This would have been, I think, the Mitchell Dairy. Of course, it's no longer there. You can see the ubiquitous milk cans. And just south of this site in Chase Park, it's a little park, I think, owned and operated by the town of Roxbury. There's the remains there of a quartzite plant. So it's, if you like to poke around among ruins and wonder about what if, which I do, that's a nice place to go park for an afternoon and just tootle around a little bit. At West Shore, this is getting almost down to the Housatonic River Bridge. There was a passing sighting here. The location was not open to the public, so they did not generate or terminate traffic here. But the site maps show a caboose that was placed there, likely for the use of crews that would have had to double a hill or on work trains that were doing repairs to the nearby Housatonic River Bridge. So this is not the caboose that would have existed there when the railroad operated, but it would be a caboose typical of what likely would have been put there from that period. I mentioned water tanks before. It's a little fuzzy, but it's the only one I've seen of an actual water tank on the line. And depending on location, these could have been fed by a well, in which case they would have had to pump the water. I think this was likely fed by an uphill stream, probably over here, and gravity kept it filled. And you can see the standpipe here. The train would have simply pulled up, stopped with a tender opposite the standpipe, and the pipe would have been turned, and the hatch on the tender open, filled it up, and then closed down, put the standpipe back so it wouldn't impinge on the right of way, and off they go again. Shepaug Station. This is the last station before we get to Housatonic River. And again, you can see it's just an open air little halt. You can get out of the weather, but you can't get out of the cold. And therein lies a very sad story that John Dwyer of the Southbury Historical Society shared with us. The station, or the halt, I guess you could say, burned in 1927. It wasn't rebuilt. They might have kept the platform there, but that would have been about it. It now resides beneath the waters of Lake Lillinola. But in February of 1917, a lady named Catherine McAvoy was traveling up from Bridgeport to Litchfield to take a job as a cook. She'd sent a letter ahead to announce her arrival with the assumption somebody would be there to meet her. Sadly, nobody was there to meet her, and it was likely the last train of the day. This was it's an isolated area now, but it was isolated to the point of desolate back then. She froze to death and she wasn't found till the next day. So who'd have thunk, looking at a little picture like this 100 some odd years later, the tragedy associated with it. So I thank John for sharing that bit of information with us, which I've obviously added to my repertoire. Then the station was only about 500 or 600 feet north of the Housatonic Bridge. You can see the original bridge was built, it was a Howe truss built of wood in 1883, but as traffic picked up, it was replaced by a steel bridge. And of course, this is looking south in 1946. And when they abandoned the line, they took out the bridge. So you can see it being scrapped here. This is the same view looking south. And they started in July, but it takes a while to scrap a railroad. So this looks more like late September, maybe October, but you can see a crane here going south and taking out the steel work, and the stuff easily salvageable would have been put on flat cars, and the rest of it went into the river. This is now underwater, but this is these are some cool pictures that I found on the web. The left is an aerial view from 1934, and you can see the track of the railroad going around in a 180-degree curve. Here's the bridge over some rapids on the Housatonic, and the station would have been just up here. This is obviously a post flooding aerial view that I got off Google Earth, I guess, satellite. You can see dotted in the line of the railway, all underwater now. And I stumbled onto this really little cool inset. Mr. Mark Lurie. I've never met Mark, but the site said he was an avid fisherman with, I assume with a sense of history, or he had never done this, but he had sonar that he took out in the lake. And this is a picture that he took of the piers of the bridge beneath the water of Lake Lillinola. And I just could not resist tucking this in one corner so people could see the support of the bridge still exists. It's just out of sight unless, God forbid, the dam ever burst. Once we're across the river and heading toward Hawleyville, this is the penultimate stop before we get to Hawleyville. It was called Hanover by the railroad, but I think local people might also have called it Mulligan's Crossing. And it's a toss-up whether it was put in response to local well-to-do summer residents that wanted to avoid the trip into Hawleyville by team, or Mr. Upham who wanted to get to his cannery in Hawleyville without having to ride a horse or whatever. The station is long gone. You can the platform, the foundation is still visible. I think this was moved and it became a summer cottage someplace. And on one of my trips north, I would like to go. I have a picture of the foundation, but I would like to see if I could find where the superstructure went. So again, if anybody knows something about that, if you'd share it with me or Stephen, I will add it to the growing pile of knowledge, because I learn something new every time I do a presentation like this. Then we get to Hawleyville. Hawleyville, as I showed on the schematic, was kind of the center of the universe. The little station, this bit in the center, dates to the time of the New York and New England, and when the Shepaug built down in 1871. Then a later addition was put on the east end, and another to accommodate the growing freight traffic on the west end. This would be the end aimed toward Danbury. On the background is the Bethel extension, so this picture has to be pre-1911. And you can see a train on the background either going to or from Bethel. This was a very busy line. This shows Hawleyville was significantly rationalized in 1911. The original line from Bridgeport came up like this and went over to Danbury. The original line from Litchfield came down and across down to Bethel. The original line from Waterbury sort of tootled up like this. Well, you can imagine if you got a couple trains a day on a little podunk railroad crossing a main line with 150 trains a day, that's a great annoyance. So what happened is after 1911, when the line to Bethel was abandoned, this is Hawleyville Road, just for a modern day orientation. All of this is gone. You only have the lumber company sort of over in here. But this was all abandoned. So instead of crossing the main line here, they just brought the Shepaug in at a little angle like this and simplified life for all concerned. So then we go from here. You can see this would be less than a year before the Shepaug was abandoned. You can see the Hawleyville station here. This train is coming east from Danbury and is just moving on to the Hawleyville, onto the Litchfield branch here. It's a little K1D mogul. We go down to Plum Trees, which is only a couple miles south, sort of southwest of Hawleyville. This is a period photograph showing where it crosses East Swamp Brook. This is and I may have, if I messed up the name here, I apologize, because when I looked at my slides in horror the other night, I decided I noticed I had the names printed or spelled out two different ways, and I was not sure which is correct. So this is not intentional. It's due to my stupidity. But if the person that shared these with me is watching, if they want to send me the correct name, or if somebody else knows, I will change this in a heartbeat. But I will say that they were very kind, and they went out after my last presentation and they took this picture in the winter, which is wonderful. I took one last summer. I elected not to show because this is so grown in. Even at high noon, you'd need a megawatt flash camera to light this up. So wintertime is absolutely perfect, and I certainly appreciate the trouble that they went to give me this view, so you can juxtapose what it used to be to what it looks like now. And then we get into Bethel. This is cool. This is a period photo of the Congregational Church in Bethel shortly before the time that this line was lifted, because it ran right up what is now Main Street. This is a picture I took last summer of the church at 46 Main Street, and you'll notice this building still exists. You can see it in the photo, and you can see where the train would have disappeared through the trees here, through what's now a housing estate. Any indication of where the tracks went has disappeared because of the housing complex built in there. And you sort of have to interpolate where it jumps from here through the complex to the bridge that I just showed. And then the line would come in and it would terminate on the Danbury and Norwalk Railway at Depot Place. You can see the Shepaug went up here. So when a train came down, they'd cut the engine, run it up here, turn it on a turntable, back it down, and off they'd go. So this was a lovely little station dating to 1852. This view is from an atlas in 1879. The station burned in 1899. It was replaced with this station, which I suspect still exists in Bethel. This is one of my photos. Electric trains, the overhead is gone by now, and I think Metro North has replaced this with a modern, probably more of a shelter with high platforms to accommodate the original, the newer equipment. But this is where the trains would have come in, had a passenger train come into Bethel before the line was abandoned. So how did they control traffic? The only signals on the line were what they call order boards at day train order offices. They had operators at Litchfield, New Preston, and the other places you can see. I underlined Hawleyville because being on the main line, they likely would have had distant signals controlled by an operator in the signal towers, and they were to just inform train crews that they were approaching and to slow down if necessary, etc. The operators doubled as freight and passenger engines to control meets, and they were managed by information passed to or from a dispatcher, likely at Washington in Danbury at this period of time, passed by telegraph or later telephone for the governance of the crews. They used what they called flimsies, and that's just because they used this really cheap, thin paper, hence flimsy. Two kinds of orders, 19 and 31s. And 19s, the operator could just hand up to a train on the move. The engineer and the conductor would pick them up, and then they would be governed by those orders. Something more serious, a train would have to stop and the crew would have to sign for the order, so that would slow down the trains a considerable amount. But those were the two methods used back then, well before radios, of course. And the agents doubled as Western Union agents, so they would handle private and commercial telegrams as traffic requirements of the railroad permitted. The New Haven began dieselizing with switchers in 1931. They bought a big fleet of road diesels in 42 to 45. And they continued to dieselize rapidly after the war. They couldn't get rid of steam fast enough. So steam was gone by 1952. And of course, when they did that, the return to their bottom line just absolutely jumped because they didn't need the overhead of handling coal, ash resulting from coal, the water facilities, specialized back shops and stuff like that, where they would have to customize parts for steam locomotives. With diesels, you just call up or write to the manufacturer, they'd send you the part you needed. So it was basically a remove and replace, but that wasn't the case with steam. So the last diesels to operate on the Shepaug were diesels, and they're DEY class switchers. In New Haven had over 60 of this particular type of engine that they bought from the American Locomotive Company back in Schenectady, New York. So this is in Bantam on a freight train, not long, only months before the train, before service ended on the line. Traffic density on the line, I just looked up some of this. In its heyday in the 1920s, about 785 tons a day on each of two trains going north, and more coming back, several hundred tons more per train coming south, basically reflecting the stone and ice traffic that they would have moved, and the milk traffic. They had hopes for other traffic, but of course, just as the railroad started, the iron traffic at Mine Hill evaporated, the furnace failed. They couldn't compete with the more efficient producers in northwestern Connecticut and later the Mesabi Range. They lost the Washington Match Company. They overlapped for a few years, but basically the company was too far from major markets and it was too hard to keep enough people in town to operate the plant. Stone worked until the 1920s when that dried up as concrete became more common. Ice remained until the 20s when mechanical refrigeration came in and ended for absolute sure on the 28th of August 29 when one of the largest, if not the largest, ice house in Connecticut on Bantam Lake burned with a loss of its total loss of its contents, 9 railroad cars, and of course all the ice. So that's now a part of the White Memorial Fund, the trust that they maintain. They had better luck with the creamery, which operated in the 20s, but of course that closed by 1928. So in the end, they were left with a supply, and the equivalent, whatever the equivalent of the supply was up in Litchfield, because I know they took bulk fuel too, but they would take bulk fuel oil, coal, power poles, and things like that. Lower value, high volume truck that trucks couldn't, cargo that trucks couldn't steal away. Just recently, the Friends of the Litchfield Community Gateway have done a wonderful thing, and they've opened up the Litchfield Community Gateway so you can hike along the path of the railroad from Litchfield Station almost down to where the old Bantam Station was, and it goes right past the White Farm Nature Museum, and you can hike down in and see a lot of the remains that are left of the ice plant. You can see a photo here. It was like the burning of Rome. It was an absolutely huge fire in 1929. My recommendation, if you want to do this any time of year but summer, if you go in the summer, bring lots of mosquito repellent, because if you don't have it, the mosquitoes will levitate you. I made the mistake of doing this in summer, never again. Passenger service, just like with the freight service, about 2 daily round trips, about 5 cars per train. And service was fairly robust up until the teens, early 20s, when again, the automobiles started really killing them. From the summer of 1905 until 1913, they ran a direct train, so you wouldn't have to change at either South Norwalk or Danbury or Bethel. For wealthier clientele, you could ride a parlor car all the way directly to Litchfield, but again, this ended. Passenger service on the extension, that ended in 1908, freight in 11, and then of course they tore it up. We've talked about that, and we've talked about already the passenger trains, the gas rail cars, then mixed service, and then freight only to the end. And the end was pretty grim. If you were a rail enthusiast, which would probably be the only person, unless you were out of your mind, to ride a mixed train, then you would leave Hawleyville at 8:40 in the morning, get to Litchfield at 11:30, run uptown to do your business, or have somebody meet you at the station, because at 12:10, the train would leave again for Hawleyville. So if you missed it, you were in for a hellacious taxi fare or an overnight stay in Litchfield. Almost to the end here, Local 10 plied the line 3 days a week, and toward the end, probably as required, because there was so little traffic remaining. The line was still barely solvent at the end. I think for the year 1947, they had a net profit of about $2,400. But of course, that wouldn't begin to cover the expected cost to repair the Housatonic Bridge and relocate the line, which would have been required because that area was going to be submerged by Lake Lilanona. So their tenuous existence ended in 48. When the New Haven finally petitioned again, it was granted. They ran the last train in June of that year. And in 48, that was the 3rd longest abandonment in the United States. So happily, the railroad lives on as hiking trails in the depot, Litchfield, and other places through courtesy of organizations like the Steep Rock Association and others. And with a bit of imagination on a summer evening, you can still conjure up a whistle. 2 longs, a short, and a long, and know that the railroad still lives. The last train, rest his soul, my friend Peter McLaughlin was a New Haven engineer who loved the Northwest in this particular area. He came to my first presentation that I'd given and asked, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course." And when he told me that he thought it was a great presentation, that was like a parish priest being told by the Pope that you did a good job. So I was totally tickled. Peter, because train crews keep logbooks, Peter provided me the name or the logbook, the information for the logbook maintained by Ed Hines. He was the fireman on the last train to run up the Shepaug. This is not the last train, but it's indicative of a train that would have run on the Shepaug, a freight. The line was embargoed in June of 48, and what that means is After that date, nobody could tender traffic intended to terminate on the Shepaug, and nobody on the Shepaug could tender originating traffic. So the last train, a cleanup train, ran on the 22nd of June, 48, behind one of the diesel switchers that I showed you. And that was the end. After that, it was the scrappers. So this is a brief bibliography of information and web sources that I have used to put this together. And Stephen, I'm sure, will share this. I think this is being recorded, so each person tuned in today will get a delivered by the web, a video copy of this. But I'm sure Stephen would share the stuff off the slide, or I will, if he's unable to. Either way, it's out there for people, because the more people know, the happier that I am. Acknowledgements, you always stand on the shoulders of people who went before you. Just a minute. Several of the people who went before me are now deceased. But I've put in memoriam for them. Mostly all my friends are still on the right side of the grass, which makes me a lot happier. And I thank everybody that has been so generous with sharing information or photos or just time yakking about it, which helped me pick up things that I might have picked up because I'm so used to it. So if I missed somebody, my sincerest apologies. My intent was to try and cover everybody. And that is the end. And I will shut up and have a drink and turn it over to Jean.
Thank you so much, Don. This has just been absolutely fantastic. During the lecture, we've had some very interesting comments come back from the audience. And so just as you were talking about, that you learn something new every time you give the presentation. So there are some pieces of information that have come in that I think you would be interested to know when the lecture finishes. We can share that with you as well. I don't know if you feel you've got time for any questions, but as I said, most of the comments have been just additional information. We had two very brief questions, one from a gentleman, Shmuel Yerushalmi, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, wanted to know what were the social benefits of the Shepaug Railroad, just very briefly.
Okay. Number one, I will put in a plug for the museum. If you look at the Washington timeline, I wrote the railroad portion of that for Stephen. And one of the points made in that is it totally opened up the area around, well, obviously, probably a Teams Day difference, 5 or 6 miles either side of the line to both commerce and passenger travel, where it might have taken 7 or 8 hours before the advent of the railroad to travel from Litchfield to down to Hawleyville, where you could get down to Danbury. Now you can make it in about an hour and a half. And of course, moving heavy cargo over dirt roads at the time would have been impossible. But once you had the railway, it just became easier. So milk, stone, all of that stuff, things used by a general store, all of that stuff shifted to rail. There's a wonderful picture that I wasn't able to show, but it's a picture taken, Elliot Davis, I think, shared it with me, of a boxcar positioned right outside the Allen store in Roxbury. And it shows people walking down a plank from the boxcar with goods obviously intended for the store into the store. So it opened up the area incredibly.
Thank you so much. There was one question about whether or not ice was shipped from Bantam in refrigerated cars. Somebody seems to have answered that no, right? Is that true? It was not shipped in refrigerated cars.
I think probably what they would have used would be maybe not modern day reefers, but they might have used insulated box cars. They'd have an inside layer and they'd have had sawdust or horsehair or something like that. Because obviously they didn't want the ice to evaporate it'd be in big chunks, but they didn't want it to evaporate. So big chunks, the evaporation or the melting would be, minimal by the time they got it to where they wanted to go.
Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. This has just been marvelous. It's just been spectacular, really. And you've taken us on an amazing, fascinating 32-mile journey with a 77-year history. So that's an amazing feat. So you impressed us with these mighty steam locomotives that were cutting edge in their day. And you've also given us some new insights into historic landmarks that we pass every day. We'd like to give special thanks to our sponsor, the Danbury Railway Museum, and we'd like to encourage members of our audience to visit the Danbury Railway Museum to see the museum and also to ride trains because it's wonderful. It's really, really wonderful if you haven't done it. So thank you all in our audience for your attendance and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.